Well, hi, everybody. It's David Leese here, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and a warm welcome to everybody for joining us today. On today's discussion, you may have heard that there's an election going on, and we're glad that you could join us across the country, coast to coast, on this day of Thursday, March the 27th, 2025. We have lots to talk about today, and I'm very excited about our conversation. We've got choices. It's been said to govern is to choose. And so during an election, it epitomizes the whole process where we come together at different levels, whether it's at a local level, a provincial level, or in this case, a national level, and make choices about policies that have a huge impact on our lives and better, wise policy decisions that affect our lives. There certainly is a lot of news going on. It's interesting. I don't know about you, but I am a little bit sad that Hudson's Bay is going into receivership. I know there's going to be some, I believe, six stores left. But what about a iconic company? I believe it was founded, if memory serves, in 1607. And we certainly think of all the employees that are losing their jobs as certainly things have changed or transformed in terms of the retail market as so many things go online. And there's certainly a very competitive um, marketplace when it comes to retail. I'm curious, will you miss Hudson's Bay? Will you? What do you? Why do you think Hudson's Bay has disappeared? So that is one of the headlines. We also know that Alberta just released a report summarizing the incredible challenges of its energy industry if there's going to be caps on emissions for that industry on oil and gas. That's a major report. It's another thing that caught my eye was interesting that the Fraser Institute released a report this week about crime rates in Canada, and it's fascinating the level of crime that's kind of resurged in Canada. It's still relatively low in many respects historically, but it's obviously a real concern when we talk about crime rates really across our country in both small communities and large ones. Um, we know that Toronto and Vancouver have higher property crime rates than I believe New York City and Los Angeles. So I thought that was interesting. Um, and then, of course, there's all kinds of other countries. I know that Winnipeg and Lethbridge had significant crime rates, but also property crime rates. So, what's the solution to that? So that's another conversation. So you may have heard there's an election call, and we will be voting on April the 28th as Canadians for our next government at the federal level. So this is an important time where we can discuss these issues. And so I want to lead with this clip made by Prime Minister Mark Carney.
There is so much more to do to secure Canada, to invest in Canada, to build Canada, to unite Canada. That's why I'm asking for a strong, positive mandate from my fellow Canadians. I've just requested that the Governor-General dissolve Parliament and call an election for April 28th. And she has agreed.
There you have it. That is Prime Minister Mark Carney announcing his conversation with the Governor General to seek the dissolution of Parliament. It's a little bit confusing because Parliament has been prorogued for quite some time now, where we are obviously set up for an election for April the 28th. So with me here today to talk about this time, we're going to parse a lot of information that I hope you find helpful, and we welcome your comments and we welcome you to share this conversation with people. We really appreciate those comments a lot. And it's interesting. I have an initial comment by Annetta Vickies, I believe the name is. Yes, me too. I'm devastated that this is probably taken over by the Chinese regime. They probably have taken over malls and stores and land. Well, it's a good question to what extent we face those challenges from the People's Republic of China, but certainly we'll miss. I think you're referring, Annetta, to the changing space of our economy. So, yeah, what do you think? Your comments are welcome. So, my next guest is Robert-Falcon Ouellette. and he is a former Liberal MP from Winnipeg. We're so glad that you could join us, Robert.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Di Macomb Contactancy, Mataniata Wapamtukuk, all my relations, everyone across Canada. And in politics, we often say coast to coast to coast. They always love
Exactly.
to say that in Ottawa, not just the two coasts, but the three. I always thought it was a bit of a hyperbole, a little bit, people just talking a little too much. But anyways, just happy to be here from coast to coast to coast.
No, right on. And that reference to another coast is actually very apropos, because one of the things that's very much on our radar as a country is, frankly, sovereignty from coast to coast, but also up to the Arctic as well. It's really quite an incredible country, isn't it? So, Robert, I'm so glad you could be here, because we're going to welcome as well another former MP. She served in Winnipeg as well on the Conservative side of the House, and her name is Dorothy Dobbie. So a warm welcome to you, Dorothy. And I know that we've got perhaps some internet challenges, so hopefully we can bridge those over. But not to worry, we're going to have this conversation today because this is a very important election. And so my question is, I'm going to just ask you, like, I mean, I know I appreciate your analysis so much, and we've had an incredible program where we talked about the need to, frankly, strengthen public service in this country, both elected and non-elected. And I think you two both epitomize fine public service in our country. And so I'm really grateful that you can join us. But my question to you is, you've seen a lot over the years. Is this the most important election in a long time? Robert, you want to go first, and then Dorothy?
Well, I think they're always important. Any election, it's a huge choice for any country. It's certainly an unusual election.
Oh dear.
That is true. It is an unusual election because of what's going on down in the United States. And I think it's really impacted traditional voting patterns with what's going on right across the country. And I think it's actually quite unfortunate, because I think it's forcing people into these corners where we're not allowing Canadians to really look at what we're going to be doing, not just in the next short term, but really what's going to be happening with the economy, on housing, on Indigenous issues, on the economy, on jobs, on immigration right across the country. And instead of really talking about what we're going to be doing with even resources, it's going to be really difficult to have an idea about where we should be going in the long term. And I think it is an unusual election. It's an important one. Perhaps not the most important. I don't know. John Diefenbaker might say something against that, or Sir John A. Macdonald, the very first election in the country's history, might be considered one of the most important as well. They all have their importance.
Okay, so every election is important, but it sounds like you're agreeing with maybe the premise of the question, that this is maybe an extra special election given all of the above. Would that be? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Robert.
Well, I think it's an unusual. I think it's outside of the norm, just because what's going on. Like the Liberals are trying to go for another miracle government. Justin Trudeau in third place in 2015 came back to form government. No party had ever done that before, winning a few, pulling things off with the least populist vote in 2019, 2021. And here we are with the Liberals, going for the Hail Mary pass, bring someone in the Mark Carney to see if he can actually do something different and offer a different vision. With the same team mostly, which is interesting, but it is certainly an important election. Yeah. And I think with Trump, he certainly seems a little bit, I'm going to choose my words carefully. Not sure what the end game is for the Americans and Donald Trump and the White House. I'm not sure where they actually want to go. I'm not sure if everyone knows where they want to go. It seems that it's changing yardsticks every day, but it makes it very hard for us to run an election here and to come up with some, people who should be in charge of our nation for at least the next 4 years, or at least a minority government, to see, what's happening.
Okay, so well said, Robert. And I think one of the comments I just want to clarify that you were making earlier, are you concerned that during an election that we have real discussions and debate as you need in a healthy democracy about those very real issues that affect Canadians. It's almost like with this dynamic with the US is the danger that kind of frankly all the oxygen gets sucked out of the room and we don't really have those discussions.
Yeah,
Is
of
that what
course.
you're
Well, what are we
alluding to?
talking about today? We're talking about the auto sector, which is extremely important, but
Yeah.
we're not talking about seniors. We're not talking about poverty issues. We're not talking about crime across the country, immigration levels, whether they're
Yeah.
sustainable, whether they're important, and what we should be doing. And so we've ended up with an election which is largely being dictated uh, by one individual in the name of Donald Trump, and I think that's actually quite unfortunate for Canadians because there are so many issues. Like as an Indigenous First Nations person from Saskatchewan,
Mhm.
I like to talk about in some Indigenous issues, and I'd like to know what the
Yeah.
party's vision is for the country. I know Pierre when I was in Parliament with him. I know he has a vision about economic development, but I'd like to know what Mark Carney his vision is for the nation. And even
Mhm.
Jagmeet Singh, I like to know what he's going to be doing
Yeah,
and how he wants to go
indeed.
about pushing things forward. If he's satisfied with how it's gone, or he wants to see changes in what the government's been doing for the last 9.5 years.
Right on. So there's a lot of important issues in this election. So, golly, it sounds like that's some very good advice, Robert, in the sense that let's pay attention to all of the issues. Don't just let's don't just obsess about what's coming out of the White House as well here. And Dorothy, I'm not sure if you could hear us
Yes,
as well,
yes, I
but
can.
Dorothy, so is this an extra important, special, super duper election this time? Dorothy, what's your comment?
Well, it seems, sorry, I've got a very bad case of laryngitis, but it does seem to be focused on Trump deliberately. And really, there's just so many other issues. I heard Robert, and he was absolutely right. So many other issues that we should be talking about. I did a CBC panel on Friday this week, and all the other two wanted to talk about was Trump. And I think that's kind of, pointless because he's going to do what he's going to do. And there's
Mhm.
nothing we can do to stop him. But we're going to be here long after he's gone. We've got a country to run.
Okay. So again, you can see why I'm speaking to the audience here, and I mean this sincerely. You can see why I have Robert and the great Dorothy Dobbie on because right there you hear a lot of wisdom, right? We've got a country to run here. So let's grow up and pay attention to all the issues. And there's a lot of them.
Well, actually, I would like
And as
to address one thing that Dorothy had just said. I'm also not convinced whoever is the prime minister will make a huge difference because I think the Canadian state, the institutions that we have as a country, are actually very resilient. And I think we're going to be able to confront whatever is put forward by the Americans. We have a collective wisdom. There's, our military, our economists, our businesses, and everyone seems to be moving in the same direction. Whether it's Doug Ford or other premiers, even Wab Kinew here, who's NDP, Doug Ford Conservative. And I don't think it really matters who might be in the leadership role with Donald Trump because he is so unpredictable currently.
Yes.
And so I think the more important issues is what's the overall vision for our nation and our country. And I think that's what, and I agree with Dorothy on that. It's not that Mark, I'm sure is a great guy. And I'm sure everyone thinks, just go, Robert, you're a liberal. You should be saying Mark's the best and that's it. But I'm actually trying to be quite objective and looking at things
Mhm.
from an objective perspective, trying to understand what's going on and not just be a hyper partisan, but really trying to, think about what's in the long-term interest for myself, my kids. I have a lot of children. It's important to think about their future.
And it's
Very
kind
good.
of this debate right now is kind of irrational. There's a lot of hysteria. I hope you can hear me because I'm really having trouble with my voice. But that's harmful because come on, we're going to be here. No matter what Trump does, we're still going to be here. We're going to be doing business. Yes, there will be tariffs. We will survive. So let's focus on how we survive, where we go, what we do. And I don't like this idea of reciprocal tariffs. I think they're pointless. They hurt Canadians, and all parties are saying they want to do this. Makes no sense to me. We should be looking for new markets. And if we can't deal with him, we should do it anyway. Maybe it's a wake up call for us. And we should be talking about some of the issues that you suggested, Robert, because you're quite right. There's more to life than Donald Trump.
Oh my gosh, that is, I think, a key headline from today's discussion.
Don't tell Donald.
So thank
Wow.
you. Yeah. But no, but sincerely, we have a nation to run, and therefore, as adults, we say, what can we do within our own power to make the choices in our nation? And so we need that healthy debate and discussion during this election more than ever. So I really like what you're saying. I think I'd vote for both of you, perhaps.
Really?
Uh, but as much as we're obviously nonpartisan today, we're very much focused on the analysis. So I think this is an excellent discussion. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, you mentioned about comments. I think both of you have alluded to this. Is almost like a kind of a hyper partisanship that's going on. And I know, Dorothy, you wrote with the Frontier Center, I think, a very thoughtful analysis about how do we strengthen public service in this country, both elected and non-elected. And I think you go into a lot of detail. And this week we released, I think, a very interesting episode of Leaders on the Frontier. I had both of you on, where we talked about that paper. I encourage people to look at the Frontier website on that. But you talk a lot about why that partisanship has risen. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's risen and why it is a problem in our country, quite frankly?
I think in every organization, there's always an attempt to centralize power. And so if this has happened over time, probably over the last 40 years, the PMO, for example, in Ottawa, has become more and more and more involved in the day-to-day management of the government's affairs, as opposed to their MPs going out there and representing, their various constituencies. So there are lots of details on this. Robert's more up to date with what is happening right now. But one example is where leaders' offices, whether it's a PMO or a Premier's office, hire the chiefs of staff of ministers. That basically takes away the power of the minister to make the kind of changes he needs and places it in the hands of a non-elected person who maybe deals with the public service. Now, when I say that, it's because that's the main avenue of communication. So the non-elected person, who's the chief of staff or somebody else in your office, gets the information, makes a decision to take it to the PMO rather than to the minister. And then, so when the minister says, I didn't know, I absolutely believe him. That's just an application of responsibility and power.
Okay, so that gives us some very powerful background. And can you relate to that kind of analysis, Robert, as a former MP?
Of course, there were so many times when I used to wonder about my colleagues, why some of them had been elected. So many intelligent people with amazing backgrounds. Many of them come from all different walks of life. And yet when they get to Ottawa, they seem to forget, why they're there. And they just want to play the game and be quiet and just kind of get along. And sometimes when you get along, it's good. But, Parliament is important for a reason, and it's loud for a reason inside. It's because it's the focal point of all the different interests right across our country. And it's important for MPs not just to defend the viewpoint of the Prime Minister or the PMO. Sometimes it's a lot of staff that make a lot of the decisions, lickety split, and 30 seconds they make a decision, and that's the policy of the government. But MPs need to stand up more and be willing to do so in public to say, that's the wrong course of action, and we need to change that because it's going to have an impact on many other people. And I've seen taxation issues in Ottawa that sometimes MPs were willing to stay stuff behind closed doors, but were never willing to take it farther. And the PMO knew that they had no courage to say it out publicly. And so the PMO would just keep going with the policy because people would get in line. And I always used to think, well, you were only elected, and only be there for 4 years, 5 years, maybe 8 if you're lucky. But most MPs actually the lifespan of an MP is actually quite short. And so I think if you're there, you might as well be able to look yourself in the mirror when you're done being an MP and say, I fought for everything that was important for my constituents.
How can you go back to your constituency and not, look people in the eye and say, yes, you had an issue, and yes, I brought it up and I dealt with it for you, or I'm trying to deal with it. How can you look them in the eye and pretend that you did something when you didn't? Or how can you be a member of Parliament or the MLA, and not answer your phone, or not even have your staff answer their phone, and not respond to emails. That is constant now, and that is so frustrating.
Okay, so can you just clarify that, Dorothy? Are you saying that we're in an age where it's hard to even talk with an MP? I thought they were our representative, the people's voice.
Well, they have private numbers in Parliament right now, so you can't. If you know the secret, you can probably get through, but maybe not. Because chances are the chief of staff is going to answer that. There's a P9 or something, Robert, that they call it, the private number.
They do have their private email, indeed, but they also many MPs send out the generic automatic response when you send an email to them, just saying we'll look at this and we'll get back to you. Most of the times they don't have chance to get back to you, or they're not interested, which is unfortunate.
And sometimes they don't even do that. But you can also phone them if you have a private number. But again, I've tried that because sometimes the guys will give me one, and I can't even get through to the chief of staff because they don't answer the phone. So it's very difficult to reach your member of parliament. And I've done it. I've always said to people, look, go to your constituency office because they're closer to the situation and they'll be more helpful to you. And in many cases, that's true. But I've encountered cases where it's not true. The constituency office is not answering the phone either. So how can you get
Okay.
represented when people don't respond to you?
Exactly. So this is during a time, an election period, and I'm talking with former MPs, Dorothy Dobbie, who was with the Conservative Party from Winnipeg, as well as Robert-Falcon Ouellette, who's with the Liberal Party. What I'd like to do is just reflect a little bit about kind of the larger picture of this election. And I'd like to begin with a little bit about, well, quite frankly, the state of the country. And I'm just curious what your take is on that. I look at, for example, and I think I have some slides here regarding the current opinion polls, and we could maybe reflect on that briefly here. And I think Madam Producer has this. So this is an interesting one. This talks about when Canadians are asked over the years what they anticipate the future standard of living to look like. And if you look at the colors here, you see a lot of, well, pink, which kind of refers to when people are asked over the last 10 years, they kind of anticipate that our standard of living for the next generation will be lower. So that's why that pink is getting bigger. And then the green gets smaller and smaller as we get to today in 25. So it's kind of, well, it's kind of a sad comment, but it seems like Canadians are anticipating that their standard of living will be lower. So what does that mean? I mean, you're former politicians. What does that mean in terms of the mood of our country?
When people are discouraged, they're feeling depressed, they feel that there's no hope, and that's ridiculous. We have a very wonderful, rich country. We should be able to make everybody, feel very wealthy and able to help others because that's what we do. And yet they are afraid now to do anything because they're worried about tomorrow. That's not healthy. And I think one of the things we've done is we've relied on the United States too long, the low-hanging fruit. We've forgotten to be resourceful, and so we're fat and happy, but it's not helping us. It's like that whole syndrome of too much welfare. It's what I call it as enslavement. I know Robert will relate to this. And you have to help people, but you can't take over their lives. And if you give them everything without like encouraging some sort of self-support, they become weaker. And I think that's happening to Canada.
Interesting. Robert?
Well, I think those statistics are quite upsetting, actually, to think that people don't have much hope. I remember when Trudeau was elected, hope and hard work will get us there. And it doesn't seem that he left much hope in the Canadian population, 70%, things are going to be lower. And but you see this in the supermarkets. You see this when you're out, at the no frills, the low laws. There's seniors in the morning and making tough decisions about what it is that they're going to buy. You see families trying to make tough decisions about the food. I've talked to multiple people who say, well, I don't eat as much meat. I just can't afford it. I'm feeding my kids the cheapest thing. If the meat comes on sale, 30% off, it's then I might buy the meat if it's even already on sale as well at the same time. And I think this is really unfortunate. And I think this actually comes back to, some of the decisions that were made by the government. They did decide to run deficits, and deficits usually, from my understanding of economics, I was on the finance committee for a little bit while I was in Ottawa, did 4 budgets. But from my understanding, is when you have a deficit, it actually leads to inflation over the long term. And, we've seen an increase in the size of the deficits. We're back to the end of the Trudeau and the Mulroney years when we had really, really high deficits that were structural in nature, very hard to deal with, which caused massive inflation, and then led to some major consequences for the Canadian economy, high unemployment on the long term. And this is a tax on people, because inflation essentially takes away your earning power. And I've seen it. I have children. I need to feed them. And it's unfortunate, the government policies that we put in place, everything is balanced. And this is what I think often about Canada. We live in Manitoba. We have a little bit of aerospace. We have a little bit of manufacturing. We have some service industry. We have call centers. We do a little bit of French here. We have a lot of newcomers, but we have a very mixed type of economy, a very well-balanced economy with some resources. And we haven't been doing that, I don't think, at the federal level. I think we've been spending money very quickly and very fast, and it's kind of like water through our fingers. And but we're not quenching that thirst and about what we want to get to in the long term, and we're getting a little dehydrated here.
Okay.
I also think that the popular media is trying to get people to watch them, so they're becoming more and more hysterical. And I noticed, I saw earlier some of the stats showing that older people are voting Liberal and younger people are voting Conservative. And one of my contacts here has noticed that at the doors at the same time. And it's because people are watching that very negative news day after day after day after day on the news channels, which is always predicting doom and gloom. And is their favorite word this year is existential threat. We've used that word before, right? People are afraid that the world's going to burn up because of climate change. They're afraid that they're not going to have any money. They're not going to be able to buy houses, and they kind of promote that with their discussions instead of saying something positive and something hopeful. All we get is negativity. But the younger kids are going online and they're seeing a variety of different opinions, and I think that's healthy.
Okay, so this is a fascinating discussion because it sounds like you're trying to, through your analysis, break through the noise and say, hey, Canada will continue to exist. We're not going to come to an end tomorrow, but it doesn't mean that we don't have challenges, and we can't see those. We can see those before our eyes as we go to the grocery store, and we kind of struggle with issues like affordability. But I think it goes back to your comments earlier, both of you, that during this election, there's a myriad of issues that we need to discuss. So I think that's where this is an important time to get at those issues and say, how do we renew Canada? How do we strengthen this country? It's interesting. There was a comment from James here who says, thanks, time to build again. So that's a good theme. Madam Producer, I think I have some other slides here that relate to standard of living as well. These are demographics on who's voting for whom here. It's interesting that we have the red, which represents the Liberal Party, the blue, the PCs or Conservatives. And then, of course, we have the orange for the NDP. And then there's smaller slivers for both the Green and I think the People's Party. And I think the light blue is the Bloc. So what this seems to suggest is that in this case, the people who are more educated are voting Liberal. And that's social class as well. So there's more working class voting for the Conservatives, if I'm reading this correctly. Does that surprise you, Robert and Dorothy, as you see that kind of graph? I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it's really the comment is on education and social class.
That's never surprised me. What I've observed over the years is that Conservatives tend to be people that they're self-made. They maybe didn't have much to start off with in life, and they've got out there and they worked hard and they've made a living, and they don't have time for to spend years getting a PhD or something like that. And I see it a generational thing too, because maybe that person went out and did a really good job and made some money. Then their kids did all right. Then the grandchildren are very expectant of everything to come to them, and they don't do as well, but they have a lot of high degrees, and they tend to vote left.
Interesting. What is your take, Robert?
Well, I think it's returning to perhaps more historical norms or the way it used to be. If you think about Diefenbaker, the Liberal Party used to be the party of big business.
Yeah.
Diefenbaker was the person who was very populist, the Western provinces, looking after the farmers, looking after the people who were the workers. And then there's Tommy Douglas with the NDP, looking after the unionized workers. But in this case, I think we're going back to that norm. When you see the upper class generally vote Liberal, I think that's more historical, and I think it's returning much more to the norm. Though you might think the upper class would vote Conservative in order because there might be more tax breaks. And I was actually surprised in this election to see Pierre Poilievre announce such a significant tax break during the election, even more so than the Liberals. But the Liberals announced more spending on the military. So maybe it'll all balance out the budget in some way at the end. It's kind of a big question about how everyone's going to pay for all these big spending items. But, at the end of the day, if you do want to see increased productivity, give people money back, and then they'll spend it on hopefully things in their neighborhoods, on the economy. I know that people, what they say in economics is if you give someone who's in the upper classes a tax break, they just save it and reinvest it. But if you give someone maybe in the middle class or those in the working class additional funds, they will spend it, and they will then stimulate the economy, which is good for jobs and good for employment. And so, there's two ways of looking at things. So, hopefully we'll see how this pops out, but it's going to be an interesting debate, but impressive nonetheless to see what Pierre Poilievre put forward.
It really is. I did want to notice that from the audience, Robert Kerr says this business of older people voting Liberal is completely overblown. Liberal tax and spend has brought down the GDP per capita over 10 years, and that's all that needs to be understood. Well, thank you, Robert, for that comment. So I did want to show, with your help, Madam Producer, some of the other slides that show where some of the public opinion polls are at. And I want to describe it as this is voter intention by region. And if we just highlight that, you see the West tending to go blue. That is Conservative. Whereas as you go east, it looks like, particularly in the Atlantic provinces, now even in Quebec, which is a bit of a surprise, you've got more Liberal support. The point is that you have what looks like a horse race. I mean, you have the Conservatives at an overall, 38.8%. Now, this is from February, so we don't have an up-to-date number that we could put before you today. But, I mean, this looks like a horse race. Is that a fair comment, Dorothy and Robert?
I think it is right now. I think it's still early, and it's going to be very interesting to see how things turn around in about 2 or 3 weeks, because people are still getting to know. They don't really know either candidate. I don't think they see Pierre in the House of Commons being very bulldogish and going after the attack dog and that sort of thing. They haven't seen him the way he is when he's in a more normal situation, and they certainly don't know who Mr. Carney is.
Robert?
Well, I was interested in the numbers in Quebec. The Quebec region is actually going to be quite interesting, but we need a little bit more time. But there's a reason that the Liberals decided to have a very short election. Give people less time to think about things. Keep it emotive, keep it on the emotional level, so that in the reptilian brain, so that people have to vote very quickly based on emotion. But in Quebec, the Conservatives are really concentrated around the Quebec City area. So they're probably going to come out with at least, I think, probably around 12 seats. The Bloc, maybe they'll even do well in the regions. I don't know, the more rural areas in Quebec. They do have a tendency in the past. They have had social credit people who were elected back in the 70s in Quebec. But then, Montreal, Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals on the island. Mainly. And so it's going to, it might be, depends on where you are and how it might turn out, but it's going to be, and where Quebec usually goes, if Quebec starts leaning one way, I think the country usually will soon follow afterwards a little bit. There'll be kind of a wave. Trudeau couldn't have won his majorities without Quebec. Doesn't mean Ontario is not important. Also very important in Toronto. I'm just I wonder what's going to happen with the NDP.
Yeah.
I never would have thought they would have gone down to that floor, but I think people are rather scared, and they've fled the NDP to kind of go to the Liberals. It's not that the Conservatives have come down too much, but it's just the NDP keep going down. And how far can they go down?
Okay, so I do want to grab a hold of a couple issues there because there's a lot to unpack there, as they say. The first one is, who would have believed that just in December you had the Conservatives with basically a 20-point lead, and things have kind of flipped in terms of focus on issues and emotion. And this is kind of a simple analysis, but basically one of anger towards the state of Canada to one now of fear, a la Orange Man Bad, as we talked a little bit earlier. So now you've got a horse race. And so my question then is, well, first of all, Robert, you mentioned that the electoral period seems to be very short, and you're saying tactically that's because it's to the advantage of the Liberals don't want a long period. Is that what you're to?
Yeah, I don't think it would be in the interest of Mark Carney to get to be known too much. We might not like what we find under the hood. Look at the car. Yeah. The car has been shined up. It's been cleaned. We waxed it. It looks pretty nice. It's shiny and new. But if you lift up the hood and you start peering in a little bit, maybe you'll find some problems with the shocks and the motors. Maybe the pistons are worn out. Who knows what's going on inside that car?
Here.
Yeah. Well, cars are expensive. You got to have the cars. Maybe there'll be a tariff on it.
Will be more expensive soon, according to the news. But I think that also what we see in Ontario and Quebec is a lot of urban voters, and urban voters tend to vote left as well. They live in a different world than rural voters. So as further west we go, at least in the prairies, there's a much more balanced urban-rural society. And also I think that we have a lot of new voters in Canada, and usually they will side with the party that they came in on. And we've had Liberals for 10 years, so this is not unusual.
Okay. So the other point I wanted to come back to is that both of you seem to be suggesting that elections do count. So even though this is a relatively short period, basically a month, this is a dynamic time. It could shift considerably as people get to know each other. And I would say, from my perspective, I would say this is probably one of the most high pressure campaigns. I mean, I think that the public has a high degree of interest in this campaign. I think there's all kinds of data that shows that there's a large number of Canadians interested in this. So it's a high pressure stakes. So in that, this election really does matter. It could shift. Is that what you're saying, Robert and Dorothy?
Yeah, well, I'm waiting to see what happens during the debates. I think that's going to be, for me, most important few nights to hear what Mark, Pierre, Jagmeet, and Blanchette and Elizabeth May are going to be debating. And in fact, actually, it hurt Mark Carney this week when in Quebec he refused to participate in a debate with TVA, which is one of the main TV stations, reaches a lot of people. It's one of the free channels right across Quebec. You have Radio-Canada, which is the CBC, but you also have TVA, which is a private network. And he refused to participate, and it fell through.
Would you speculate why? Was it the cost, or is it some other reason?
No, I don't think cost for the political parties at that level. I don't think it's super important. 75,000, I think they can find the money somewhere. But I think the main issue is, the more exposure in French, it's harder to control. And I think you want to limit, especially against Pierre. Pierre is a formidable debater. I had to debate him a number of times in the House and on the Finance Committee. And when he wants to tear a piece off of you, he certainly can. And, he wasn't called the pit bull for nothing.
In all français as well.
Yeah, I'll say. And he's very, very good in French. He does have a bit of an English accent to him, but I think Mark's French is not as good. And, Jagmeet's, French is pretty passable now. He's had a few, almost, a number of years to work on it.
I think that people have given it the impression that somehow Pierre is not very smart, but in fact, he's very intelligent. And that's why it makes him so formidable in the debate, because he's quick on the answer. It's also why he rhymes things. I understand that. It just happens naturally. And it's irritating. I don't like it, but it comes out of him just that's the way he thinks. It's kind of like Mulrooney back in the day. He has a masterful vocabulary. He's the only guy I ever heard use the word poltroon in a conversation. You know,
Well, I know
We'll have
Pierre
to work
growing
that
up, he
into our
was,
discussion.
yeah, but Pierre growing up, I think he's from Alberta, from Calgary.
yeah,
He's a Franco-Albertan growing up. He went to the French schools there, not immersion, but French schools. So
Mhm.
I know he could debate probably pretty good
well,
in
in
all the
French, yeah,
languages.
yeah.
Okay, so I do want to come back to two other significant points that have been alluded to. One is about polls, and then let's talk about the NDP. So Robert Kerr says a majority of Conservatives have already made up their minds on voting and that isn't being reflected properly in a lot of the polls. They likely aren't bothering to respond. Now, there's a lot of truth to this because we know that it's a challenge, as I talk with pollsters frequently, to get people to respond to polls. Now, what is your take on the polls? Because I see, well, let's just do some anecdotal information that we know this past week there were some major rallies held by the Conservatives in both Toronto and Hamilton. These are barn burner rallies, like 3,000, 4,000 people.
Yeah.
That's a lot of energy, certainly in volunteers and things like that. And yet, what does that mean? Like, how are you interpreting these polls that seem to be suggesting it's a horse race? Is it really a bit deceiving? I know some of the polls, I would argue, aren't worth the paper they're written on. But any comments on that, Dorothy and Robert?
Well, I think polls, I mean, people don't answer the phone anymore. Who answers the phone? Old people?
Who has a phone?
Who has a phone?
Who has the phone?
Landline. I don't have a landline. I got
And when
a
they say,
cell
well,
phone.
we're having a poll, you hang up, right? You don't got time for them. So I think the polls are having a difficult time. And so it's look what happened in the U.S. with Trump. You know, they really predicted that he was going to be decimated, and we saw the opposite happen. Did the same thing happen here? Yeah. But I do think there has been a movement towards Carney, as people are curious about him, and there's a lot of talk about him. And it's going to be that those debates and the way he conducts himself between now and the election that's going to cause the change the story.
I don't know how to interpret the polls. I know they've had significant issues over the last few years, especially since COVID, changing demographics, young people. Someone calls me, I'm not answering because I don't know, what they want, if they're trying to scam me out of money or something like that. But I was out in my riding here. I do live in Terry Dugood's riding, which is Winnipeg South. And it's a bellwether riding, supposedly, meaning it's a riding that goes with whoever gets the government gets this riding. And I see Morley Lecomte, Janice, she's a Conservative, former MLA, I believe a former cabinet minister in Manitoba for the Conservatives. And I see her signs. I haven't seen any Terry signs yet, and it's been a week. So, there's not a lot of signs out, but there are more Conservative signs and no Liberal signs so far. And maybe Terry hasn't had a chance to come out here, but usually the first things I do the first 3 days is if I got sign locations, if I'm running an election, is I'm putting my signs up, and then I restart the door knocking. So it's important.
So good afternoon to our audience. I noticed a comment from Prairie and so many others. I'm talking with former MPs, Dorothy Dobbie, as well as Robert-Falcon Ouellette. We're talking about the election and the policy choices that we're facing and observations and analysis about this historic time of our country. So on that note, I guess my question is, when you were campaigning in the day, what was it like to go door to door? Did you find that helpful in terms of that kind of conversations with people on the doorsteps of people's homes?
It still counts. I'm in Marty Morantz's riding, and at a meeting last week. They've been knocking on doors for a couple of weeks now, and they're doing pretty well. They get a lot of people at home, and it still counts. So knocking on doors, number one.
So door knocking is important, or
Door
canvassing.
knocking, most
Robert?
important. Yeah. Social media is also important, but you have to focalize it. You got to pay for the ads, and you got to bombard people and get them while they're scrolling through their phone. It's interesting, since Mark Carney was elected, my kids who are, in their teens have seen, anti-Carney ads. They haven't seen any positive Carney ads yet, but, reels that go through Instagram or YouTube, those haven't been pushed on them yet. So that seems to be what's feeding the algorithm for whatever reason right now. So my kids are asking questions around the dinner table. So it's a good conversation starter, and I'm quite enjoying it.
Okay, so
But
it's
actually, I
very
want to
interesting.
raise a subject real quick. I think there is a significant challenge that Pierre faces. Me and Dorothy were talking originally about this idea that it doesn't really matter who is in the Sussex Drive, in the Prime Minister's residence, or at Rideau Hall, to deal with Donald Trump. And I think for me, the main reason people are leaving the NDP to go to the Liberals and supporting Mark Carney is the fear of what Pierre Poilievre might do if he gets into office. And I think people are scared that he's going to cut a lot of programs like Elon Musk and Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. And I think there's this great fear among many people on the left that this is what's going to come to Canada if Pierre gets into office with a free reign majority government. He's going to be going out cutting. And I think for me, Pierre, what he needs to be talking about is trying to tell Canadians that he's going to be reasonable, that he's going to be looking after the house, he's going to be making, improvements, reconsidering programs, but he's not going to be going out cutting everything. And I think that's a lot of hard fought battles related to dental care, as an example. There are a lot of people that really think that's a great program, and they're nervous that it's going to be cut.
He's come out the last few days clarifying that, saying he's not cutting out, and making promises that alleviate pressure on people, as opposed to just talking about cut. So I think even the threat of cutting the CBC, I don't think they're going to cut the CBC. I think they're going to demand that it, get its budget under control. But you're right; he has to come out with more of those kinds of messages so people aren't worried.
Yeah, but I think his tax thing was actually quite good. And then I saw when CSIS somehow got involved in the election a few days ago, I was actually quite disappointed, because we had the RCMP do the same thing against Ralph Goodale back in with Paul Martin, in the Paul Martin government at the end. And I think it's quite unfortunate to see unnamed sources out of CSIS involving themselves in an election campaign. Their time was way before that. They had a commission of inquiry that had been called. They had the chance to give all their information, to let Canadians hear about it. Now it's for Canadians, and not for unnamed sources trying to weigh the scales in the favor of one group over the other. And it calls to question, like, what's going on with they called into question Pierre, they called into question Chandra Ira, a former friend and colleague of mine. What are the accusations? What's going on? Is he an agent of another country? Like, we don't know these questions because no one's answering it, and it's very, very unfortunate. And these are all unnamed sources.
Yeah, so that doesn't help the debate, right? The credibility of it when you have these, quote, unnamed sources, right? It's very confusing for people. I did want to come back to the question of the NDP, because we were alluding to that earlier. What's happening with the NDP? I mean, I think that if you look at their trend line of support over the years, they're at historic lows now. I mean, they're going into single digits. We'll see if they can go up again. But is that part of the story that you've had? I don't want to sound histrionic, but kind of a collapse of the NDP. I mean, this is. I find that interesting. What's going on here? What's your analysis on why the NDP support is so low?
I'll leave that to you, Robert.
Well, that's not very nice.
We don't want to say it, right?
Well, I think Jagmeet Singh has some significant challenges, and I'm not sure if it's not that people aren't ready. But I think there's also an authenticity issue. When you are in charge of the NDP and you go around in Rolex watches, when you pull out the back of your government car limousine, the high-end 2000 foldable bike and
Yeah.
wheel up onto the hill, and then have a staff member drive behind you and then fold up the bike and put it back in the car. I think it gives off a vibe of not really being very authentic and not connected to the worker. And that's, I think, why people kind of liked, in Quebec, they called him Le Bon Jack, why the people liked the good Jack, which was Jack Layton.
Yeah.
It's because he felt authentic. He wasn't taken seriously because he was a city councillor from Toronto. It took him a number of elections, and then all of a sudden he exploded onto the scene, and he had a pretty passable French for Quebec, and Anglo-Montrealer from origin, and then Quebecers really took a shine to him. And it, created something really special where they almost destroyed the Liberal Party. Like, the Liberals were almost down and out and done for in 2015. But I'm just not sure if Jagmeet is the person to lead the party. Perhaps it requires another person a little bit more authentic who can connect with voters. He has to make a really good case for people to say, come back. If you believe in progressive policies, you have to vote for us. You don't vote on fear. And it's kind of that third party. You always get caught between the two major parties. It happened to me here in Manitoba. Here it's the NDP and the Conservatives. They're the most important parties. And then the Liberals are very almost a moribund, dead party, dying. And we just get caught off at the Khyber Pass every time. We just can't seem to get through. We get caught in the crossfire.
Okay, Dorothy?
Well, I agree with Robert. I had a feeling he was going to say the same thing, even use the illustrations that I would have used as well. It is about authenticity. It is about representing these people, and tying yourself to an unpopular prime minister doesn't help. And he was very much aligned with Mr. Trudeau. And he made some big mistakes in terms of insisting on staying in that spot. And I think it was really, I hate to say this, but to preserve his own skin. So he should have bailed a lot earlier than last fall, because it could have, you knew what was happening. It started happening early in the summer. So he's been the author of his own misfortune, unfortunately. But I do think that the NDP feel, here's the difference. Unions who are government unions, or, intellectual property type unions, guys that work for lawyers and so on, or wherever they have a union, are different from people who work in the construction industry or factory workers. And they're much more open to the Conservatives, and always have been. And now, they feel very comfortable with Pierre. He talks their language when he's with them. And so I think it's fine that they're finding a natural home with them. Jagmeet won't lose his support with, the government unions, I don't think at all. And that represents most of the union people in Canada today.
Okay, so it sounds like there's some real shifts going on among traditional support within parties. I mean, I think that that's been shown that there's a lot of working class persons that are voting Conservative. They feel like that's the policies of affordability is resonating with them. I guess the other side to look at the electoral map here is geography. You notice that there's a lot of Conservative support in the West, and in the East, it's more Liberal. Does that concern you that this will, frankly, divide our country? I mean, I think that as we hear from provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's a classic concern that resources, which are controlled at the provincial level, are being stymied, that we don't have the ability to get energy, namely Canadian oil and gas, to Tidewater. I mean, I know there's proposals for utility corridors right across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even Manitoba. I know that, Dorothy, you're very familiar with a project that would go to Port Nelson. But I sense a lot of frustration within the Western Canada that the East doesn't understand the need to get up. And is that a dynamic that concerns you from a policy point of view, Dorothy?
What interests me is BC and how far they've gone to the right. They've been a traditional NDP government for a long, long time. And to see that switch there and its holding is interesting to me. I'm not surprised. The Atlantic is always sort of on again, off again. I'm not surprised by Ontario and Quebec, but I think those numbers are pretty close in both of them. I mean, they're still pretty tight with Ontario and Quebec. It's not as separated as you'd think. And again, I think part of that is the urban-rural split, vote split. And just to, that I always tie it to the kind of life you live. And if you've got it soft and easy, it's easier to vote left for some reason. At least vote Liberal. If you haven't, you've got to work hard. You appreciate the people who are willing to, put their pedal to the metal and really works. And I see that difference too. And that's farmers. They're very self-supporting, very self-sustaining. Whereas city people have a different life, and that shows up in the polls all the time. Here in Manitoba,
Robert, any
we
comment,
lost the
Robert?
city. We won the rural area. That's what happens here.
Well, I think that it already is quite divided, and I think it's been divided for a very, very long period of time. I don't think this is anything new. I think it's been going on for at least 2 decades. Even from the Reform Party time. They see the Eastern, the Laurentian elite very negatively, in a very negative way in Western Canada. Trying to control kind of the Canadian mini empire. The former Rupert's Land of the Hudson's Bay that we were talking about early on in the show. And it's but at the end of the day, just because we have these differences doesn't mean we can't work together. And I think Dorothy and I, we both know that in Parliament, if you want to get stuff done, sometimes you have to just bite the bullet and sit down and chat with people and go for a beer, have a meal together, the lunch, or join a caucus and just hang out and get some stuff done. Because it's not all about just what you see on the TV. There's a lot of camaraderie as well, and it's a lot of fun. Whether it's the NDP, Liberals, the Greens, even the Bloc. Sometimes I was on a warship once with some Bloc members, and we had a great time. They were old veterans, and I was a veteran.
So Robert, that's interesting that you underline that. And I know that Dorothy, you've talked about similar thoughts. There can be a real camaraderie among elected officials across party lines.
Absolutely.
And that's a great story, is it not, Dorothy?
Don't we still have a choir, Robert? An all-party choir or singing group?
Only for Christmas.
Only for Christmas. But there it shows you. When I was there, we had a women's caucus, and it was all parties. So there are various things that what you see in question period is high theater, it's drama, and it's got a purpose. Just like the fact that the house is 2 sword lengths apart had a purpose. That symbolism is important. And so yes, we do get along. And when we're finished, we get along even better.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that people can get along, because I think that's what Canadians are looking for, is the common sense that the MPs do care about our country and that they're trying to serve us. So during this election, what advice do you have for us as citizens? What are the issues that you encourage us to keep our eyes open for as this election unfolds? Any advice on that?
I would say look beyond the obvious. Don't just accept what you hear. Do your research. Ask questions. Call your campaign office. Go drop in and see. But they have to say go to both if you're not sure, or go to all 3. Because if you just let other people do your thinking, you're going to get a bad result.
Exactly. Robert?
I think people shouldn't be afraid to vote how they want to vote. At the end of the day, if you vote based on fear, you might not like the end result. And I don't know how much more time we have, David. Do we have a lot more time?
A few more minutes, yes.
Well, I just want to talk about just a First Nation issue as well. There are a lot of First Nation voters. In 2015, they came out massively. It was just after the Idle No More protests that had happened in 2012, 2013, and people were very, very motivated. I don't see that same motivation right now in this election. None of the parties yet have addressed those issues, and the Liberals only win if they get people who are motivated to vote. They need to get people excited to vote for something. And, I haven't heard Carney talk about anything really Indigenous. I know he's talking a lot about battleships and frigates and destroyers and military spending and more military spending. but that doesn't ensure that Indigenous children have a good education, and it doesn't ensure that there's a good healthcare system.
And that's a
And
very
that-
big frustration because when you mentioned the Northern Port, this is an Indigenous-led project, and we're having a great deal of difficulty getting some powers that be to pay attention, because this opens up a whole world of opportunity for folks in northern Manitoba. And these folks living in isolated reserves, their lives are sometimes very miserable because they don't have any transportation. The only way you can get to some of these, like Shamattawa, is over winter ice roads. And if you have an early spring, then they're really in trouble. So it's time to open up opportunities for Indigenous people. And I think that should be a whole debate.
Indeed. So one of the charts I wanted to share reflects on the whole issue of economic growth and prosperity in this country. And we want to look at this the last number of years here. And Madam Producer, if you could bring up that chart that shows the rate of growth here in our country. We can see on a chart here that some last 10 years, Canada's grown less than Canada's at the very top there in red, at less than 2%. The last many years here. And we've got Germany, they're at 4.7, Finland at 6.7. We go all the way up to Spain at 17%, almost 18, Denmark, and then of course the United States coming in at a whopping 20.7%.
Unbelievable,
in terms of GDP. Does that surprise you? And what does that tell you? Like, our country seems to be on a decline here. I mean, I think that's a pretty stunning representation that we're just not moving forward. Why is that?
There's no productivity. When you're relying on everybody else to do your work, and I'm talking a lot about, the exports of the work we do with the United States, and we don't manufacture anything here anymore, very little. We do some, but not like we should be. We're not utilizing our resources. If we're not creating wealth, there's no wealth to be had. There's no growth. And we're not. We're relying on wealth that was created in the past, and that's not going to sustain us.
What do you say, Robert?
Well, if I was looking at it as the government, I would say, well, we didn't actually go backwards. We grow 0.5%.
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
And so there was growth. We're on the chart. We're not on the negative, but it is hugely problematic. I think we've actually relied on a lot of newcomers to fuel the economy. And we use them as like the new natural resource for many job creation, a lot of job creation in our country. They come in, they spend a lot of money at universities, they get their education, they buy housing, they need clothes, they need appliances. Yet I don't think we've really taken advantage of that. And I think we've become quite a bit complacent in what we do with that resource of all these newcomers wanting to come to a really beautiful country, clean air, generally okay roads, could be better. But we're not adequately trying to really capitalize on what they're doing. And we're not using that capital, the people, to make more links and trade links around the world. We rely on things which are easy. We just keep dealing with the United States. We need to be dealing with Asia more. We need to be selling more to Asia. We need to be selling more finished product to Asia. Here, I once had the Turkish ambassador when I was an MP in my office. Because he was there to look at lentils in Western Canada and in Manitoba. And he said, well, and I asked him why. And he said, well, you sell us the lentils. We take them back to Turkey. We repackage them. We process them. We add value to it. And we'll sell them back to you at 3 times the price.
He said that.
Yeah, he said that. Yeah. And I was like, wow, you guys have figured it out. Like, why aren't we adding, processing our own lentils and selling them back to the people in Turkey? Because they love lentils in all sorts of countries around the world.
The same thing happens to our oil and gas. We export most of it to the United States. They refine it, because we used to have refineries all across the country. We had 2 or 3 in Winnipeg. And they sell it for 6 or 7 times the price that we charge them for it, for the raw material. So it's just that kind of lackadaisical approach that is getting us into more trouble. And if we don't create that productivity, if we don't provide those opportunities for people to do something, we're not going to thrive. I would also say that one of the things we do with these newcomers that come to the province or the country is that we don't give them the opportunity to reach their full potential. I'm thinking about doctors, nurses, engineers, people in the professions. It's so hard for them to get accreditation in Manitoba. It's just really sad when you take a taxi and the guy's a doctor and he's driving a taxi, or he's an engineer, or he's a professor
Yeah.
of some sort. That's wrong.
Well, even if he's driving the taxi, he still won't give me any advice about some of my medical problems. So.
Well,
Like you have
but
him.
the point is that I think we all agree that Canada should be the most prosperous free nation on the face of the earth, and even
Yeah.
higher than the United States, from my perspective. And so in this context, I mean, it's interesting, Robert had a comment here, hewers of wood and drawers of water, as they say, we need to change this drastically. It's 2025, not 1955. And
Right.
you're here, as they would say in the House of Commons. So this is the point, is that we have lots of work to do. And surely this election time should be a vigorous discussion about policies that will move us towards a shared vision of prosperity. And it seems to me that it seems like Canada is at a historic fork in the roads here. And I know that there's different choices, so I don't mean to sound simplistic here, but we have, gosh, we have to look at our taxes and say, are we competitive? I know that in the United States, I don't know if people are aware of this, but there's a proposal underfoot to get rid of income taxes for anyone who earns $150,000 or less. They're not going to tax tips. They're not going to tax overtime. And now they've got this special gold card where you will get citizenship if you can up $5 million and get a citizenship in the United States. So it's not just the flow of money that's leaving Canada.
Yeah.
It's the flow of people, that entrepreneurial class that builds a nation. And this is where it's like, I don't know. I think that, okay, so it goes back to some of your earlier comments that we've had conversations about, Robert and Dorothy. Is there this kind of Ottawa bubble that doesn't get the fact that most of the jurisdictions in Canada, not all, are seen fundamentally as hostile places to do business? And that's part of the issue that we need to talk about. Like, are we going to become like, is everything going to be done by the government? And we know how successful that is. Or do we actually have a vision that Canada is the most competitive place on the face of the earth, so we actually attract money and business capital and know-how so we can build this country and knock it out of the park? I mean, to me, that seems like a key policy issue for today's election.
If you look at the amount of resources that go to the governing of this country, it's shocking. It's more than half. So how are you going to survive and thrive with that kind of? It's non-productive. Yes, you've got 20 people working in an office to do something, and they hire a consultant to make it happen. How does that work?
Right. Yeah, it's very hard to do business. So I don't know, Robert, am I being too cynical or too?
No, but I think you're right. I
pessimistic?
think there is the Ottawa bubble. It's very beautiful in Ottawa. A lot of great museums, and everything's very clean. And the people are. I had a friend tell me. He said in this neighborhood that we live in the Glebe, it's the highest per capita number of PhDs in the entire country.
Yeah.
And he said, my wife,
Productive.
and he said, and he was a retired professor, and his wife was a PhD, and the next door neighbor was a PhD. But that's not the average world, and people need to work for a living, and we need to have jobs in companies, small-ish companies, medium-sized companies, easy to start, easy to get going, good capital. But the government loves these grandiose ideas sometimes. And sometimes it takes a few years to build up manufacturing. It takes a few years to build up, that competence and that expertise in that field. But then people have that difficulty of obtaining loans, and the BDC interest rates are quite high. Yet the government had no problems in the last few years of spending billions of dollars on super clusters in technology and farming, but you're not sure who really received that money and if they actually really needed that money, or if it was just money that was, that would have already been spent for large corporations, when we need to encourage the small business owner who they can grow it, 5 employees, 10 employees, 20 employees. And then,
Indeed. Yes.
that's important. That supports families, that supports a whole community, that pays taxes in a community, and it's localized. It's not like a corporation like Brookfield, where they're based off in a tax haven in Bermuda, which is, what we've also heard in the media in the last few days as well, from one of the leadership candidates, with offshore wealth, which is rather unfortunate.
Well said. And finally, I want to ask you, as we get to the end of our conversation, the role of the media in this election. Now, this is the first election, if memory serves me correctly, where some 2,000 media outlets are fully, not completely funded, but they have the access to federal funds. Do you have a sense that that's really had an impact then on the ability to have these healthy, vigorous debates about the issues? Or, I mean, I could critique different news outlets in my humble opinion, like the Globe and Mail, but I won't. But the role of the media is really important to have that estate that speaks truth to power. Is that been undermined? Like if you look at that funding of media outlets, and you can argue, well, that was well intended, or it was a way to manipulate them. What's the impact in your mind?
Well, first of all, if they wanted to support local media or Canadian media, buy ads in the traditional media. They put all their money into the internet, which goes to the United States. So that's one big deal. We've got a huge budget federally. The other thing, when they put that money up, I don't know what happened to it, because here in Winnipeg, we've got the Winnipeg Sun has started up again. Got a number of investors who went in. They're crazy because of the terrible business right now. But they all put up their money, and they're reinvigorating the Sun. I said, well, you guys should be able to get the same grant the Winnipeg Free Press got. He said, no, there's nothing there. There's just a little tiny amount of money for a writer. I said, no, that's not true. It's $6 million what the Free Press got. I looked it up, and it's disappeared from the internet, but it's still apparently live. So you tell me, what's the reason behind that? Why is the government interfering in that kind of business? I mean, the media should be independent. That's my message to them.
I do think there is a bit of a bias in the media, and I do think it generally favors the Liberals. I have noticed that on the CBC. They're covering live today Mark Carney. It doesn't mean that what he's talking about isn't important, but at the same time, you need to ensure that you're giving equal press to all the political parties. And sometimes I have listened to like CBC's Power and the Power and Politics. And I do think there is a bit of a bias in favor of one viewpoint versus another. But sometimes maybe that's just my impression. I don't know. I think it requires someone to sit down and study exactly what each word means. I'm sure there's a linguist out there who can, perfectly define it and come up with a measurement and a number to say this is the amount of positive versus negative coverage, and this is the amount of coverage someone received. But I thought, for instance, when Mark Carney decided to go to England and France, I thought it was actually quite astute, because he essentially he goes alone. There's no debates. He has the media talking about him each and every day. Usually it's positive because he's shaking hands with people who don't want to cause waves. There's no critiques when you're overseas. There's kind of this convention. And so he got a lot of good press coverage before the election started. And I thought it was, it was actually quite a smart thing, to be honest.
Very interesting. Well, we have had quite a far-reaching conversation, Robert-Falcon Ouellette, as well as Dorothy Dobbie, and I want to thank you for joining it. And I think what you've done today is kind of peeled the perennial onion about some of the issues, the nuances, the analysis. And I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
I want to thank people for listening when I have no voice.
Well, look, and I want to thank our audience for joining this conversation as well. You've made a lot of insightful comments, and we always appreciate it. And certainly every week on Thursdays, we have this live conversation. We appreciate it so much. And I think it shows and underlines the importance of you, the citizen, to be involved. And I think that's one of the messages that Robert and Dorothy left us with today is make sure you get out and vote and think carefully about the policy choices that we face in this election. And we wish you all the very best this next week.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you for watching